But first, we begin with an emotional reunion on U.S. soil. 3 Americans wrongfully detained in Russia reunited with their loved ones in Maryland late last night before heading to San Antonio, Texas. Paul Whelan, who had been held in a Russian prison for more than 5 years, told reporters it felt good to be home.
As we came over England and I looked down, that's when it became real. We flew over Ireland, then Canada, and into America, and then I knew I was home. So getting off the plane, seeing the president, the vice president, that was nice. It was a good homecoming.
Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kurmasheva, and Paul Whelan were greeted by the president and vice president as they exited the plane. President Biden later praised the other leaders involved in the exchange, praising Slovenia for coming in at the last minute.
Toughest call on this one for other countries, because I asked them to do some things that were against their immediate self-interest, and really very difficult for them to do, particularly Germany and Slovenia. Slovenia came in at the last minute, and I tell you what, the chancellor was incredible. He was incredible.
Harris also praised Biden to reporters, calling the swap an extraordinary testament to the importance of having a president who understands the power of diplomacy. CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins me now to talk a little bit more about this. Good to see you again. Willie, talk to us about this historic and emotional homecoming and the negotiations involved in getting these Americans home.
Hey there, Anne-Marie. Good to be with you this morning. I was watching this live last night, and you couldn't help but smile when the 3 Americans got off that plane. It gave President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris a hug. This is certainly something that the Biden administration is celebrating. Of course, we saw earlier yesterday the vice president and the president putting out statements celebrating the return of these 3 Americans and greeting them on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews last night. This was a monumental event, of course, getting these prisoners back to the United States, back to U.S. soil. In the case of Paul Whelan, waiting nearly 6 years to be back home here in the United States. And the president behind the scenes working the phones, talking with key leaders like the Prime Minister of Slovenia, also Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, negotiating this deal, where we've learned that the Vice President was also heavily involved. She met with both leaders on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, and notably with Olaf Scholz. She had a private meeting compelling him to agree to this exchange, the exchange of a prisoner that the Germans were holding that the Russians wanted back. So this was an intense level of diplomacy at the highest levels involving the president, the vice president, but also multiple government agencies like the State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, and of course the White House National Security Council as well, Anne-Marie.
So Wall Street Journal assistant editor Paul Beckett was actually on CBS Mornings earlier today, and he talked about how President Biden and countries like Slovenia were vital in this exchange. I want to play some of what he said this morning.
We've thought there had been hope before, and only to find disappointment.
Exactly.
So we felt in the last couple of weeks things were starting to move, and you heard President Biden talk last night. You know, there were key allies in this, Slovenia, Germany. They started to come around. We reported yesterday that literally hours before he pulled out of the presidential race, President Biden was on the phone to the Prime Minister of Slovenia saying, you need to help us, and we need to get this done.
Prisoner swap since the Cold War.
Yeah.
So what else have we learned about this? Because this was really sort of a game of sort of 3-dimensional diplomatic chess, if you will.
Yeah, it involved 7 different countries, not just the U.S. and Russia. And if you involve those 2 countries, that's difficult enough, right? So the president working the phones on July 21st. Remember, that is the day that he bowed out of the race for the presidency and saying that he wouldn't run again, and endorsed Kamala Harris, his vice president, to essentially be the likely Democratic nominee. But the president working the phones hours before, speaking to the Prime Minister of Slovenia, as was mentioned there in that sound that you just played. This happened just shortly before he sent out that message on X to the American people saying that he would bow out of the race. And I'll also note that the president held a meeting earlier in the year with the German Chancellor that I want to mention in the Oval Office. And he talked about relationships last night. The vice president touched on this as well. He talked about not only those familiar relationships in terms of the families that are involved in all of this, but those relationships with those world leaders. And I want to tell our viewers a quote. The German Chancellor said, "For you, I will do this. That's according to a senior administration official telling CBS News that the German chancellor told the president that in that February Oval Office meeting that the two men held. So clearly a lot of diplomatic chess pieces moving around the world, if you will, but those personal relationships, both with world leaders and families, of course, matter in this instance, as the president and vice president mentioned last night.
Really does. Willie, thank you very much.